Well, hello everyone. We're going to begin a video presentation of different methods to clean ebonite stems. And I am going to limit this video to the cleaning of stems rather than any repairs. So I'm not going to be showing you anything about how to remove tooth chatter or repair or patch holes in the stem. This is only going to be about cleaning, and we're going to limit it to ebonite, or what's also termed vulcanite. So to start with, we should talk a bit about what ebonite is. Ebonite is a rubber. It's a vulcanized natural rubber, and the vulcanization process is done by combining rubber with sulfur and some other chemicals, and then heating it. And depending on the amount of sulfur that's included, the idea is that the sulfur will actually cross-link the rubber molecules. So you can think of rubber as sort of being a mixture of spaghetti noodles, as an example. And you know, these noodles are all kind of moving in and out, but they can slide against one another. So the rubber is very malleable. You can mold it into different shapes, and even after you've molded it, you can then go back and remold it again, because these things are sliding all around on one another. What sulfur does plus heat is it actually cross-links those molecules, so it puts bridges between these different spaghetti noodles in the rubber mixture, so that once the mixture cools, it sets into that shape, and these things can no longer slide against one another. So you can make a rather rigid structure, and vulcanite or ebonite is one very rigid hard rubber. The problem with vulcanite, and it's very good material for pipe stems, because it's a relatively soft on the teeth, yet it is durable enough to withstand a lot of use and frankly a lot of abuse. But one of the problems with it is that sulfur is susceptible to oxidation, which is combining with oxygen in the atmosphere. This is a process that's accelerated by exposure to ultraviolet light. So if you have pipes with ebonite stems, keep them out of sunlight as much as possible. The real problem is that once this oxidation process occurs, the surface sulfur is actually oxidized to sulfuric acid, which then attracts water, and the combination of these things leads to discoloration. Or oxidation, which appears as a discoloration. So I've got three stems here that I'm going to be working on. This first one, these are all ebonite stems. This first one is somewhat lightly oxidized, so let's bring it up close here and get our focus in. So you can see there is some discoloration down in this area here in particular, and there's some buildup behind the button, which very often occurs in stems. I'm not sure of the cause of that. I've heard it referred to as calcification, suggesting that it is some sort of a calcium deposit, but I don't really know that for a fact. It's something that's relatively easy to clean up, though. And there's also some discoloration here, and if we look on the back, you can see this sort of brownish cast that we're getting, as opposed to a jet black finish. That's the oxidation that I'm referring to. This one is relatively mildly oxidized. Hopefully, pipes in your collection, if you're maintaining them, this is about as bad as they would get. Now this stem does have some tooth chatter on it here, but I'm going to ignore that for this video, so just pretend you don't see the tooth chatter, okay? So we'll go through this one first, the cleanup procedure for this, and this is the simplest case, and again, if you're maintaining your pipes, this is about the most you're going to need to do. Now, if you're not doing such a good job, you might have a stem that's more like this. Now, this isn't in terrible shape again, but it's got a bit more. I mean, you can see there's definitely a difference in coloration between here and, like this surface here, which is nice and shiny black. This is clearly oxidized, and that oxidation actually extends throughout the bulk of the stem. It's just lighter down here than it is up here. Again, that sulfuric acid combining with water is an important component of the discoloration. So the part that goes in your mouth is always going to discolor more, because it's the part that's exposed to moisture more often. And again, there's some buildup right behind the button, and we'll talk about how to get rid of that. This is a slightly more significant case, so this is going to require a bit of sanding and the use of micro mesh pads to bring it back to life, but not a difficult job at all. In our last example, this is an estate pipe that I'm working on right now, And you can see this stem does not even look black, but if you look down here at the end, which was in the tenon, so this has been covered for a long period of time, this is the color that it should be, and this greenish brown color is the result of oxidation. And if you could feel the surface of this, it is actually quite rough to the touch. And that's because this is really heavily oxidized and begun to pit. So this is going to take a bit more extreme work to bring it back to life, and we'll go through that process as well. Again, it's not difficult. The method I'm showing you is going to use basically 3 tools and a few chemicals that you have easy access to. The 3 tools that I'm going to be using, well, the first one is a relatively easy, simple one, and that's a simple single-edged razor blade. You could use a pen knife, you could use a safety pin for that matter. Anything that we can use to sort of get into the button and get rid of that buildup behind there. And I'll show you how to do that. Second tool that we'll be using for most of the pipes, most of the stems, are these micro mesh pads. And these micro mesh pads are really wonderful for buffing stems. You can get these in a set. I got this from Amazon, and you can see it runs from a 1500 grit all the way up to a 12,000 grit. So you can do some really fine high gloss buffing with these. I will usually use up to about 3200 with some water to do a wet polish, and then 3600 up, I just use them dry. And I'll show you that process. These are available on Amazon. I think I paid about $18 for a 2 set of these. So I got this pack of, what is there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, there's 9 of them. So I got this pack of 9 plus another pack of 9 for $18. So they're relatively inexpensive. They're reusable. You can wash them. They're a sponge-like material. They last a long time if you're just using them on stems. I highly recommend looking these up. And they're just referred to as micro mesh pads. So if you search Amazon for micro mesh, you'll find them. So that's tool number 2, which also we're going to combine for this guy in particular with some sandpaper, just to go to some slightly coarser grit. So I'm considering those all part of the same tool. So we got a razor blade, we've got sandpaper / micro mesh pads, and the third thing is, you can pick these up at the grocery store. I don't have the original box, but this is a Mr. Clean Magic Eraser. And these are fantastic for these lightly oxidized stems. These really work wonders. And I'm actually going to start off with that stem right away and show you how simple this process can be. So the Mr. Clean Eraser comes in these... Pardon me, I had to turn around to get my scissors. The Mr. Clean Eraser comes in these large blocks, but I actually cut them. Each time I do a stem, I cut a piece off, and the piece I usually use is only about, so it's about half the width of the block, and I don't know, that's maybe a ½ an inch. There doesn't seem to be much of a difference between this surface and this surface. This has a little bit of texture to it, but for what we're doing, I don't think it matters that much. So the Mr. Clean pads cost about I don't know, it was $1, $2 for those 2 pads, and then this will last for many, many pipes. I'll throw this away after this stem, but it gives you the idea. Now the first thing we're going to want to do is deal with that stuff behind the button, and that's really relatively simple to deal with. Let me just zoom in a bit here because I want to keep my hand braced. See, that looks fairly good. So you can see there's some buildup there. I'm just going to take this blade and I'm going to very, very gently just slide it up to the button. I'm not applying very much pressure against the ebonite. I'm just sort of letting the blade guide itself. And hopefully you can see that buildup is just chipping away. Oops. Trying really hard not to dig into the ebonite. Just letting it guide the blade up and catch on the buildup. And once that's done, I can turn it sideways and bring the blade in like this. So what I'm trying to do here is, yeah, you'll be able to see it better like that. bring this blade in so that I'm just kind of going right along the inner edge of the button there. It's a gentle scrape. I'm really trying to not scrape off any ebonite, just dealing with that buildup. And we're not going to get it all off, we're just going to loosen it, which is fine because the eraser will take care of the rest. And that looks pretty good. We'll do the same thing on this side. And you can take your time with this and get, you can see that's coming off quite nicely. Hopefully you can see that. You can take your time with this and actually get quite a bit of the buildup off. But a little bit of elbow grease with the magic eraser will do much the same. And again, do keep in mind that I'm ignoring the tooth chatter on these, which might bother some of you if this were your pipe. This is my pipe. This is one that I smoke regularly, so I'm not too bothered by that. All right, now I need some water, and I of course have left the water slightly off to the side here. We'll use magic editing to get rid of that pause, I hope. All right, so magic eraser is like a sponge. We're just going to put some water into that sponge. And we want to, I'm going to squeeze this off to the side. We want to saturate it. We don't want to be slopping water all over the place, but we want the sponge to be damp. And now we're just going to take it and rub it and allow the friction that this can generate to do the job of sort of buffing, cleaning behind that button. I'm going to zoom out because I can see the focus is not holding very well at this zoom level for this amount of movement. Okay, so now what will happen sometimes, and we might as well talk about this while I'm doing this. As I mentioned, the sulfuric acid attracts water, and the combination of the water and the sulfuric acid can lead to a further discoloration. So sometimes when I do this with a pipe, whether it be my own or a lightly smoked estate pipe, I find that after it dries, I have more oxidation than I started with. And it's a really interesting chemistry behind that, because what I'm doing is I'm adding moisture, so I'm actually aiding the process that I'm trying to remove. And that's okay. If that happens, it just means that I have to go to the micro mesh pads and do a bit more abrasive work on the stem, and it'll turn out fine. I've not yet come across the stem that was oxidized that I couldn't bring back to looking like brand new. So this is not something that you need to be worried about as you come across the estate pipes. The bigger problems are things like broken tenons, cracks, or holes. Oxidation you can deal with. And so now we're going to try to get into that. This is one of the spots that's always difficult on these saddle stems. I don't know what it's called, the divot or the valley, but it's always one of the challenging spots to get clean. And as I'm going around, you hopefully can hear that I'm trying to apply a fair amount of abrasive pressure in the hopes of abrading away the oxidized layers. And we'll come back up here again and just make sure that we're getting behind that button. You can see this is picking up a fair amount of surface dirt, most likely, and the oxidation as well. Now, one of the things that I want to impress on you is that to work on stems, to do this kind of work on stems, to clean stems, you don't need to have a buffer, you don't need to have a lot of equipment. These three things, sandpaper and micro mesh pads, a magic eraser, and a couple of razor blades can deal with most jobs if all you're talking about is cleaning. Oh, and of course pipe cleaners. I should have said at the outset that all of these stems have been thoroughly cleaned inside before I started doing this. Not so important for this particular type of cleaning, but when I get to the last stem, you'll understand why I want that inside to be clean before I get started. Alright, so now we've just got a clean paper towel, and we're coming in and drying everything off. And you can see it's dull because, we just sort of abraded it. It doesn't have the same kind of luster that we would have on a nice shiny buff stem, but we're going to take care of that. I'm just looking to see if we've done a good job of getting rid of the sort of surface dirt and oxidation. And I think by and large the answer to that is yes. You know, we've got sort of an even, dull shine. Again, beware that there's tooth chatter here, so that's not oxidation, it's just the way the light is catching that chatter. Up in here we seem to have dealt, there's maybe a little bit more work that could be done right in there. But I think you get the idea. So, assuming that this was one of your pipes that you're deep cleaning after 6 months or so, that kind of a treatment is very likely all that you need. But before you consider this done, take just some simple mineral oil that you can get at the drugstore. Very inexpensive, and I don't know where I got these bottles from. I think my wife might have gotten them from a dollar store or something like that. But they're very handy for this kind of stuff. I'm just going to put some mineral oil on the stem and rub it liberally into the surface. And keeping in mind that this is rubber, that this is a natural product, and it has pores in it, or it is a porous material, I guess I should say. This oil is going to soak down into those pores, and it's going to do two things. It's going to allow them to shine and give you a bit more luster on the stem. It's also going to protect it from additional oxidation by blocking water access to the ebonite. So I'm going to leave that now. I've got a small stand, which you might have seen in some of my other videos, that just has a little pin on it here that will hold the stem while the oil dries. And I will set this out of the way. I'll leave that probably overnight. I mean, a few hours would be enough. Actually, 10 or 15 minutes would be enough. But I'm going to give it plenty of opportunity to soak in, and then we'll buff it out when we're done with the other stems. Alright, so the next stem that we're going to tackle is one that needs a little bit more work. Not a lot more, but this might be an estate pipe that's been lightly smoked. It might be a pipe in your own collection that you just haven't been careful about caring for. This, frankly, is a stem from a pipe in my collection that I haven't been careful about caring for. Once again, we've got a case where there is a fair amount of oxidation on the stem. It's actually a bit deeper than the previous one was, and while it's light, it does run throughout the whole stem. So I'm going to do a buffing using the micro mesh pads of this whole stem to bring it back. And again, we've got these areas behind the button that we need to clean up using the same kind of process that we used on the first stem. So this is a bit more involved. We're not going to use the full range of micro mesh because, quite frankly, the first 4 or so are going to put a lot of scratches into the ebonite, and we don't need to reshape any of this. We don't really need to do a lot of work or remove a lot of material. So I'm going to set aside 1500 up to 3200, and we're going to begin with the 3600. And I may or may not put a little bit of water on that and start off with a wet sand. I haven't decided. I kind of do this somewhat at a whim, which I know is not how I should be doing it, but that's how I do it. So let's go ahead and see if we can zoom in so you can better see the behind the button detail. And we'll just, again, and I hope I'm doing a good job of explaining that there's really little, if any, pressure of the blade up against this ebonite. It's just kind of acting as a guide to bring it forward and let it cut into that buildup. And then this sideways scraping is very minor. Hardly any pressure at all, just enough to, you can hear it, but I'm being really careful not to remove any of the ebonite itself. And now we'll do the same on the bottom. Actually, the buildup on this one is not so bad. It's the oxidation is more the problem. And there we go. That's good enough. So that's enough razor blade work on this one. And again, we'll bring in a clean towel. Probably use more paper towels and pipe cleaners than any other item when I'm working on pipes. Okay. Oh boy, that probably got way out of shot. Sorry, I forgot that I was so zoomed in. Okay, so we want to basically get this whole thing looking glossy and black again. And to do that, we are going to use these micro mesh pads, starting at this is a 3600 grit. So this is still, compared to your sandpaper, this is a very mild abrasive, but it'll do the job. Now, one thing you want to be careful about when you're working on stems is the junction between the pipe, if my hand were the pipe, and the stem relies on this surface mating perfectly with the wooden surface. So if I'm going to be sanding on this, no matter how careful I am, there's going to be some tendency to sand over this corner here. And that's going to lead to a rounding over of this edge, which means that when this goes back into the pipe, you're going to see a gap there. It's going to create, even if it's not a gap, it's going to create the illusion of a gap. It's not going to look very good. So to avoid that, there's a couple of things you can do. The easiest thing, but the one I least like to do, is you can just leave this in the pipe. And that works great, but the problem is sometimes you sand the briar then and you can mess up the finish, and I'd really rather not do that if I don't have to. You could, of course, put some tape over the briar, and that protects it, but actually the tape sometimes pulls off some of the wax, and then you have to rebuff the briar. It's just, I'd rather not leave it on the pipe if I don't have to. Now, if it's a pipe that I'm completely refinishing and I've already stripped the briar, that's fine. But in the case of a pipe where I'm just working on the stem, I don't want to do that. So what I do is I drill a block of wood. This block is drilled a bit oversized because I didn't have a bit to exactly match this particular tenon. And then I just wrap some regular typing paper around the tenon until I get a reasonable fit. Now, this is not a tight fit. It won't fall out. Well, it will fall out if I shake it, but if I invert it, okay, it's not a tight fit. But it's good enough for it to stand up in there. So what I can do now is I can hold this in place, and I can work on these edges without worry about going around that corner. And that's going to allow me to keep that junction nice and crisp between the briar, or in this case the block of wood, and the ebonite. So that's where we are. Let's get started with that, and we will go through the grits. Now, I'm not going to bore you with every minute of this. I'm not sure how I'm going to work this out, if I'm going to be able to speed it up or just sort of phase through time, but you'll see some of this. Just putting some water on here to get it a little bit wet. These are like sponges, so the water will somewhat sink in, and we begin. Start off on that upper edge, and you can see how that's getting nice and brown as it's taking that oxidized ebonite off. Taking advantage of the sharp edge of the pad to go right up against the back of the button, and likewise to go right in along the seam. Not yet getting to that edge, which is why I'm not worried about the block right now. Now we'll work across the button again. Oops. Be easier to turn it around like so. A little bit more water. There we go. When I do this, normally when I'm working without a camera, I'll have a small container of water that I'll dip the sponge into, especially if I'm doing a lot of, if I'm starting at the lowest grit, so I'm going to be doing 4 grits with wet sanding. But then what I do is between each grit I empty that water and replace it with fresh water because I don't want to carry any of the grit over from the previous sanding. So that takes time, and I figured for this video, since I was only going to be using this one grit wet, I wouldn't bother with it. And I'll just use the squirt bottle that I have here. You could use oil, and there's some advantages to using oil when you're sanding ebonite. The problem, though, is that then the oil is very difficult to clean out of the micromesh pads, and I think, in my opinion, it shortens the lifetime of the pads. So, you know, you gain a bit by using the oil, but then you have to replace the pads more often. So I would rather just stick with water. Cleanup's easier, and it works. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with what I've done around the button and on the top. You can see this is quite dull now because I've scratched it with the abrasive. Now we're going to put this, put this in here, and just continue to all the way around. And as you can see, by using this block, there's just no way that I'm going to be able to round that over. Okay, so we've got this now polished up to the highest grid, which is the 12,000, and you can see it's brought back quite a bit of shine. It's taken that oxidated coat off, and now we are just going to once again apply some mineral oil to this. And I've mentioned in other videos that there's a product, there's probably a couple of products. The one I'm familiar with is called Obsidian oil. I believe that Obsidian oil and mineral oil are essentially the same thing. I could be wrong about that, but I can tell you that mineral oil works as well as Obsidian oil and is a lot cheaper. I've used both, and you know, Obsidian oil is a great product. If you don't do a lot of this, you might want to invest in that and just support the company. But since I do a fair amount of stem restoration, I need to economize as best I can, so I use the mineral oil. So applying that quite liberally again, and we are just going to let that soak in again for several hours. And I will just set that aside, and we'll move on to the third and final stem in this this set.